Well, we're going to turn to another important issue, and that is the Trump federal takeover of Washington D.C., so to speak, the surge of military and militarized forces into the District of Columbia by the White House under a variety of pretenses. Most of them, I personally would say, are false. But to dig into all of this and many of the implications of it, we are very, very happy to be joined here on the show once again by Lawrence Grandpre, who's the director of research at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Lawrence, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here as always. And it's interesting when this first federal takeover, when Trump first announced this, and he had the crazy press conference with him and Judge Jeanine and the whole thing. I mean, it was so over the top. So there was that, and I certainly don't want to excuse anything they were doing. But there was one undercurrent of it that was interesting to me. That a lot of like the sort of practical things they were saying about quote unquote crime in D.C., about how to address homelessness, didn't actually seem that different from the Bowser administration. Other than the fact that, obviously DC is a very liberal city, so it's always dressed up in a whole other concern, and we have services, and we have this, that, and the third. But the core basic premises of criminalization, of all these different issues seem very similar. So anyway, I say all that just to ask you as my first question is, in some ways, when we look at the kind of lack of pushback from the DC government on this issue, does some of that seem to be that this is kind of convenient for them, that Trump is so outrageous that they can use him as a foil to pursue similar things, but in a way that perhaps will seem less intense as moving forward?
I think that's part of it. So I do think that between the Ring cameras, the laws in 2024, and the increase in visible homelessness and addiction, that's a liberal obsession with crime that's not been seen since, I believe, the crack era. So we have these local news stations like Sinclair Media pumping blue cities, including DC, with propaganda consistently trying to convince, working class Black folks that the community's unsafe. We're going back to the crack era. And Black politicians are in a really tough spot because they have been forced into greatness in some ways over the past decade by grassroots activism to do things like decriminalize cannabis, and some of those invest in violence prevention, and they have led to violence declines. But there is this constant pressure from the center of the Democratic Party in Capitol that sees these crackdowns as in their interest for things like gentrification. So DC is unique because because the Home Rule Act, the mayor doesn't have a lot of power to formally push back, and she's getting a lot of pressure from political insiders, including the wife of Marion Barry, to say, keep your powder dry. Like, we got to focus on keeping the kids out the streets because the guard might literally shoot them. So it's not to say that this is a good rate situation, and we don't want to confuse performative politics with actual resistance. But the reality is that Black leaders like Bowser have been forced to capitulate to these pro-police interests, massively increasing the budget. But again, that doesn't mean that the community has not made real progress on crime through grassroots violence interventions. And we need to talk more about that, because that's the answer to how we actually deal with crime. And if we fall back too much into the root cause arguments on poverty and homelessness, then that almost can work against us, because liberals are co-opting those arguments and say, I see homeless people. I see people who have visible addiction, and that makes me feel unsafe. And if we don't have a good answer that grounds the solution in community, they're going to co-opt the arguments of the left to feed that carceral solution.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really important point you're raising. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on how liberals are actually reinforcing some of the approaches that the right likes to talk about, but they do it under the guise of sort of like a balanced approach. And you mentioned some of the whole like dealing with the root causes, but can you elaborate on what the problem is with the sort of liberal approach to dealing with quote unquote crime and violence and all these things?
So there's this obsession with procedural justice within the liberal mind. If it's constitutional, and if I can claim to be doing like constitutional policing, that's what consent decrees give us, right? So in that world, there are lawyers, there's all this process. And so when like liberals, including the governor of New Mexico, deploys the National Guard to deal with crime ginned up with things like Sinclair local media hysteria, it's seen as legitimate because it's actually a constitutional process. And you have this notion of a balanced approach. And again, we have to be precise about what's happening, because they're switching from mass incarceration, broken windows, to this focused deterrence model, that there are these criminal networks, there are these groups of people, and we only want to lock up those groups. When you talk about groups, you're talking about people in community, they group up. It's natural, right? So if you're talking about groups of people that are adjacent to violence, that's like a huge chunk of especially Black communities that have been hyper incarcerated. And again, when the left needs to be precise about how its rhetoric is being co-opted and how some ways it's not meeting the moment to have the precision to talk about this, because they use public health language, the liberals, to justify these forced deterrence, targeted policing of groups of people that are adjacent to violence. And we know how gang databases work. There can be whole entire communities, again, very similar to Palestine, where they have those hit lists if you're friends with someone who's friends with someone in Hamas. Similar things are happening, but they're using like epidemiological language, saying we have to surgically scoop out the cancer of criminality and only target those networks, right? And so when we see the left say things like don't fund police, fund public health, that ignores the ways in which the public health rhetoric has been co-opted to justify a lot of policing and a little bit of social services, a little bit of connection to a job training and cognitive behavioral therapy, all these things that they use for these violence intervention programs that come from the top down. The bottom up talks about culture, oppression, talks about mobilizing people's political consciousness as a violence prevention tool. But for the left, that's not very material. That's not universal housing. That's not universal basic income. So that gets the short shrift. But it's really the only explanation, again, as to why crime is actually declining. The blue cities that do this, Newark, Philly, Baltimore, massive declines. The red cities that don't, Memphis, St. Louis, you don't see those declines. So we have to talk about the value of powering grassroots violence intervention that use culture and use people's like lived experience to actually deal with crime, because otherwise people don't know what to do and they default to police or they default to the big box white nonprofits.
No, I think that's a critically important point, especially because that has been the discussion in DC prior to this, is the sort of kind of halfway measures that have come in where there was the big push around the NEAR Act and around violence interruption, then sort of co-optation of it, and then sort of, how to actually structure it and move it forward. And it's, been an interesting conversation and important struggle. But I just say that as an entryway into saying, I hope you could talk more about that. I mean, because this is, I think, the confusion that people have, because now that violence interruption has become kind of a meme in and of itself because of the co-optation of what it really is and what it should be and how it actually is most effective. Because as you pointed out with some of the cities you just listed, I mean, the results have been dramatic, in fact, what we've seen in terms of the reduction of murders, shootings, and other forms of crime, violent crime, quote unquote.
Yeah, so just so people have context, most violent crime isn't a homeless person on the street, isn't someone who's mentally ill. It's people in community that are in groups that are just living under oppression, and minor things lead to beefs. And you have these violence interrupters, people who are part of street organizations, formerly so-called gangs, who can interrupt conflict before it happens. So that's the important thing, is that they're actually preventing violence before it starts. And we see the right wing attack it because it's seen as basically giving thugs a second chance and they're not really reformed. But we also see folks on the left attack it. There was a scandal in DC around basically kickbacks around people funding violence prevention. And that feeds the narratives. Oh, Black politicians hooking each other up. It's not really doing the work. But again, just objectively, it's one of the only things that's different over the past 5 years. Like, what's happened is that these folks who traditionally have not been getting money have gotten, we've tried everything else. We've tried housing first. We've tried mass incarceration. We've tried focused deterrence. So it's not just that they're doing services, because anyone can do services, and a lot of people do. It's that the term violence intervention comes out of the Black Panthers in the 70s. Credible messengers is the term. And these are folks who are not just credible because they've been in the streets, they're credible because they've turned their life around. They've turned the righteous indignation that gets turned against people in their own communities and street violence into a political conscientization. And it's not just a methodology that works for violence intervention. It also can work for people experiencing addiction. So we know harm reduction is important. But again, if the left only goes to harm reduction and ignores these sort of cultural specifics, political tools that have been essential for Black people to address crime and addiction over the past 50 years of our history, they've gotten funded over the past 5 years, not because of Black politicians just being great. Community forced that American Rescue Plan Act money to go to them, right? So the left has to know that and advocate for that. Because again, otherwise, if Trump or the liberals cut the money, we're going to see crime spike. And then we're going to see the liberals say, I guess we got to bring in the National Guard, or I guess we got to do more focused deterrence. And so while we wait for universal basic income, while we work for the root cause solutions, these critical services that have been forced into these blue cities are what is different over the past 5 years that brought in these, again, 50%. Newark has had a 60% decline in murders. And you're not seeing those declines in cities that aren't not just doing the services, but explicitly using these grassroots community-based violence intervention services.
I mean, so what is it? What is it that the left is missing here? Or I guess when we talk about left, like, do you think that these are just not as known as strategies? They just don't get as publicized. Like, why are these things that you're talking about missing from the conversation? And I don't mean to, sorry, just like punch the left here, but I mean, just generally speaking, on the progressive end of things, you don't see as much of what you're talking about.
I think it's a few things. I think the assumption is when you see Black politicians and liberals sell us out, they look at the politicians and say, well, those cities, there must be nothing that's worth looking at those cities. There's nothing worth looking at there. So they don't see the grassroots organizations forcing those people to do good things because they're not champions. And so you can not be a champion and be forced to do good things. Also, it's not material. It's not $1 billion of redistribution. It's not universal basic income. The left is very materialist. And so culture feels abstract, and it feels like the wokeism that's been used to attack the left, right? And I've workshopped this a little bit, but think about it within the context of Palestine. You would never expect the Palestinians to just accept food aid from the U.S. government forever, and that would be enough to cause peace there. No, they need sovereignty, right? And same thing with just generally, just the limitations of Abu Mazen or Mahmoud Abbas or the PLA does not invalidate the idea of Palestinian sovereignty. But because of anxieties around Black political governance, the idea that it's not progressive and that wokeism has been used to attack the left, the basic idea that Black people need resources that they control, and that's the only way we're ever going to get peace in the Black community, it's not as intuitive when it comes to the Black community as it is for a place like Palestine. And just similarly, like, just because there's some limits to political Islam in Palestine doesn't mean we don't understand why people would vote for political Islamic parties like the Muslim Brotherhood. But when it comes to like the Nation of Islam, and the Nation of Islam is a critical part of violence prevention work here in Black cities, the left has incredible anxieties about those types of organizations. So it's understandable, but the reality is the community is not just choosing these entities, they are proven to work in ways that the left doesn't have a comparable example of getting these type of violence declines, but the Black community has produced it. And again, if you want to actually win over Black people, and again, linking the oppression of the tough on crime crowd is oftentimes very much the same people who support Zionism. The Lock the Black Kids Up crowd in Baltimore is the exact same people that support the Zionist oppression of Palestine. We can make these alliances actually equitable to actually have the left come out in support of getting these orgs funded and showing the links of the oppression in Baltimore and Black America to the oppression in Palestine. I think that would really require a confrontation of the left understanding the value of Black political sovereignty and solving the problems they're trying to solve. And they just got to get over the anxiety around that.
Mm-hmm. You know, real quick, since you sort of mentioned the direct connections between the Zionist movement, we talked about Sinclair Media. I know we talked about this a couple times on election night last year. I wanted you to just talk a little bit more about that, because it really is a direct, palpable connection between these two narratives here that I think deserves to be mentioned.
And you can't understand what's happening in D.C. without it. So Howard Friedman is the former head of AIPAC. He was the first Orthodox head of AIPAC. He lives in Baltimore, Northwest Baltimore, Orthodox Jewish enclave in Northwest Baltimore City in the Baltimore County. He's on the board of Sinclair Media. Sinclair Media is a right-wing, Trump-supporting entity that controls local media all throughout the country. All local media can be, if it bleeds, it leads. But Sinclair is overt propaganda. Sometimes they talk about Trump, sometimes they don't. But in Baltimore, they're running more stories about, like, someone tears down the Israeli flag. They'll run a story on that. But they'll do story after story around youth crime, youth carjacking, youth are out of control, youth are not being prosecuted. So the points you talked about in the press conference come directly out of Sinclair Media's talking points. And other people, like Citations Needed, they independently made an understanding that the way they talk about Black youth, Sinclair Media, is the exact same way they talk about Palestinians. They only understand force. They only understand violence. They have to be deterred to extreme state violence. And that's part of why Maryland has the most youth incarcerated as adults of anywhere in the country. They're literally off the chart. You cannot put Maryland's youth incarceration in the data of other states because it'll skew the data too much, right? And that's the reality of the psychology of Zionism. So when politicians like Dalia Tarr, the senator from Northwest Baltimore City, supports things like rolling back juvenile protections a couple years ago, it's an extension of the Zionist logic of the people in her district that support her and fund her, including Howard Friedman, the former head of AIPAC. And again, it's not surprising that a Sinclair media station is blasting propaganda into DC and the DC suburbs, creating this manufactured concern over crime.
Wow. Well, a lot there, and a lot we'll have to continue to keep watching as this so-called 30 days and perhaps longer rolls on in D.C. and the implications around the country. Lawrence Grandpre, Director of Research at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, thank you so much, as always, for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.